90% of scholars who study the subject acknowledge the empty tomb. Mike explained that there were multiple reasons to believe Jesus' tomb was empty a few days after his crucifixion. First, the Christian movement was founded on the principle that Jesus had been raised and was no longer dead. Christianity began in Jerusalem, and if Jesus' body had still been in the tomb, the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem could easily have ended Christianity by parading Jesus' body throughout the city. That they didn't do it lends weight to the position that the tomb was empty. Another reason to conclude the tomb was empty was the Jewish concept of resurrection. Most Jews believed in a bodily resurrection, that the very body that died and was buried would be raised on the day of resurrection and transformed into an immortal body. It would seem that if the disciples were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection, they envisioned his very body having been raised, and that implies the empty tomb. The final reason has to do with the position of the Jewish leadership. When asked about Jesus, they said that the disciples had stolen the body, implicitly agreeing that the tomb was empty. To sum up this point, Mike quoted William Wand, a former professor from Oxford University. All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history. That brought Mike to his final piece of evidence. Fact number 3, testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. On a number of occasions, we see that the disciples of Jesus believed that he had been resurrected and appeared to them. Not only the disciples testified to this, but foes of Jesus as well. Mike referenced multiple early sources to defend this point. He argued that the early church was built on the teaching that Jesus was risen, and the fact that the disciples were willing to die for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, not only were the disciples willing to die for this belief, but so were a couple of people who had been opposed to Jesus' message during his life, namely Paul and James. This point seemed problematic to me. So what if people were willing to die for their belief that Jesus appeared? That doesn't mean he did. But Mike anticipated this and clarified that, at the very least, it meant they truly believed he had appeared to them, and they weren't lying about their beliefs. His point was pithy. Liars make poor martyrs. Finally, after presenting the 3 facts, Mike made his argument. Let's go ahead and build a case now based on those 3 facts. We've seen that these facts are strongly evidenced historically, and that they're granted by an impressive majority of scholars, if not virtually every scholar who studies this subject, including skeptical ones. We can see Jesus' resurrection easily explains all of these facts without any strain. In the absence of any plausible alternate theories to account for these facts, Jesus' resurrection can be accepted with confidence as the event that occurred. In other words, Mike was arguing that Jesus' resurrection was the best explanation of the known facts, and other theories required investigators to strain, twist, or ignore the facts. I leaned back in my seat and considered the argument. There seemed to be something wrong about this. Could it be so simple? I considered alternative explanations. What if the people who thought they saw the risen Jesus had just hallucinated? Well, the tomb wouldn't be empty, would it? Plus, how likely is it that so many people would hallucinate the same thing on multiple occasions? Mike quoted 1 Corinthians chapter 15 during the debate, which said 500 people saw Jesus risen at the same time. Was there such a thing as mass hallucinations? Plus, that still doesn't explain why enemies of Jesus like Paul would have seen the risen Jesus. He would have had no reason to hallucinate Jesus' return. Well, what if it wasn't Jesus they saw, but someone else? I considered this for a moment, but it also didn't work. As before, the tomb would not be empty. Plus, was it really possible that the disciples would confuse someone else with Jesus? They had been with Jesus for 1,000 days or more. It was not a good explanation. What if Jesus didn't die on the cross? That was the Amity position, and Mike and Gary had refuted all those arguments. But when Shabir began his opening statement, it was clear he was going to argue that position. A surge of excitement overcame me. Would this celebrated champion vindicate our position after all? Shabir began speaking, and it was immediately obvious that he was quite comfortable on stage and well acquainted with the information. The fact that I am a Muslim may be a bias that precludes me from appreciating the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I want to first acknowledge that, then put it aside and look clearly at the facts. I do not find the evidence for the resurrection persuasive. If someone said to me that a man had died and was then seen alive 3 days later, I would have to ask,